So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to talk about Dr. Robert Carter of Creation Ministries International. Dr. Carter is a marine biologist cum genetic engineer. Interestingly, he might actually watch this as he knows who I am and associates me, correctly I might add, with Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal and Erica, also known as Gutsick Gibbon. Although the one time he previously deigned to reply to us as a group, he confused me with another YouTuber with a similar name and aesthetic. I want to say a special thank you here to Jonathan Sarfati of CMI, who fixed this problem when it was brought to his attention. He and I have a lot of things we don't agree on, and his work on anatomy and paleontology is infuriatingly bad, but at least he cares not to put the wrong person on blast. Now, I suspect this mistake by Dr. Carter was an honest one, and so I don't harbor any hard feelings about it, although the amount of information he gave out about the other YouTuber, if it had been given out about me, would have constituted a dox. So if you watch this, Dr. Carter, please be careful who you mention and how much of their personal information you give out. Also, while he's quick to name and shame his critics when he incorrectly thinks that they have failed to point out how bad his work is, when admitting that those same critics are right, as he recently did, he failed to mention any of our names. I found that particularly irksome, as it was in fact I who pointed out to the public, Carter included, that no, his conflation of cheetah census population size with effective population size is entirely inappropriate. Oh well. Finally, since I think Dr. Carter may be watching, I'll be addressing him with the second person pronoun in this video, and because of that odd history, I'm going to be a little more snarky than normal. So let's pick up with Dr. Carter after some introductory remarks that aren't really about science per se.
Let me give you a framework, an idea of how to think about science. What if science was just like, I'm going to call it an interpretive filter of reality?
Then it would be a philosophical position or set thereof, instead of an investigative technique that is informed by interpretive frameworks, which I suppose could be renamed filters.
What if science was just a way of thinking that might help to explain things? So one way of thinking is Zeus is standing on top of a mountaintop, and he's got his lightning bolt ready, and when I get out my petri dish and I do an experiment, he's going to either zap my lightning bolt or not zap my lightning bolt.
Then we would be invoking non-natural, fundamentally unpredictable forces, and the thing is, I feel like you're not okay with that when you call the supernatural force in your investigation Zeus, but if you call it God, the Holy Spirit, Christ, or something like that, then you are okay with it. But fundamentally, doing an experiment where you expect any God's intervention to significantly affect the outcome is useless, even if it happens to be the God you believe in, and even if that God exists.
That is a way of thinking. It's not really very conducive to science, is it?
No, and that's exactly why science adopts methodological naturalism. And remember, whenever you say you're using supernatural causation in science, I'm going to call you back to this point.
Now, it's a really bad scientific idea, but you might actually run an experiment and get the right results, even though Zeus had nothing to do with it.
Yep, even bad science can occasionally stumble on the right answer. Basically, that was how technological progress worked until the scientific revolution. People incrementally stumbled into inventions like the wheel, pillars, the arch, plows, yokes for horses, etc.
Or let's say it this way. Imagine evolutionary theory is a certain way of looking at the world. And it is.
Well, it's a way of looking at biological populations over time. That's only a small subset of all the things you could look at, and in those cases, evolution isn't really going to help.
And it does get some things right, doesn't it?
Quite a lot of things, like how to predict the resistance to various drugs and pathogens, where to find new fossils. It correctly suggests new medical treatments, it successfully predicts the outcome of genetic studies, etc., etc., etc.
Yes, it does. Absolutely, it gets some things right. And that's what Charles Darwin talked about. He never talked about what he didn't get right. He talked about what he did get right.
What? The guy talked a lot about what he got wrong. What comes to mind most prominently is the blended inheritance and gemules, neither of which is correct. Seriously, why do guys like this just make up nonsense about Charles Darwin? You know, he doesn't really matter. But also, if you're going to talk about him, you could at least not lie about him. Now, Dr. Carter, if you're not lying and instead you're just massively ignorant and making things up, or just assuming that what your colleagues have told you is true, then I apologize for implying that you're dishonest, rather than just massively incompetent. If you watch, let me know which one it is for future reference.
And that's what evolutionists ever since then have talked about. Absolutely, it gets some things right, but that doesn't mean itself that it is right.
That's true. It is indeed possible that some major aspect of modern evolutionary biology is wrong, even though it has continuously been one of the most successful theories in history. But whatever new things come along to replace it, it will have to account for all that success, and explain all the same data not just as well as evolution, but better. If I were you, I wouldn't hold my breath on that one.
Now, I'm not going to claim that my view of science is perfect.
Well, that's good, because we're going to see it demonstrably really far from perfect. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that your biases have led you to a point where on average, you're worse at biology than someone starting their sophomore year in undergrad for a biology degree.
I would never do that. But can you see that if the reality is these red lines, and your way of thinking is the gray lines, that the tighter you get your gray lines lined up with the red lines, the more you'll be able to explain in science?
I mean, instead of interpretive filter, you could have just said theory, because that's what really we're talking about. But yes, it is not a bad visual analogy. And the thing is, I agree with you that we should try our hardest to match our theories to reality, which is rather the point of things like testing, prediction, and all that science stuff.
You can see that, right? Yeah. That's science. The reason that evolution seems so profound as a scientific idea is it claims to explain everything.
I don't know what world you're living on, but it seeks to explain the origin, development, and patterns of biological diversity. That's it. It doesn't have a thing to say about how to build a computer, what's going on in the core of the Earth, how to analyze data from the James Webb Space Telescope, what your next move in chess should be, or anything else.
But what they're doing is they're only explaining the things in between those lines. They're actually skipping over tons and tons of data.
That's a bit ironic, since young Earth creationists are notorious for ignoring, in some cases, more than 9/10 of the data in any field they investigate. In fact, documenting this fact in depth and in detail is the project of The Rocks Were There, both Volume 1, which is out now, and Volume 2, which is on the way, from R.J. Downard and Jackson Wheat, both friends of the channel. On the other hand, literature searches for new research projects over in real science land can take months, and missing even a few papers can result in rejection of the research for lack of context.
And they can no longer get away with what they got away with 100 years ago. Because the scientific revolution has changed everything.
What are we getting away with?
Okay, I'm using words already. I haven't really defined anything. Let's define a couple of terms here, real simply.
That does seem like a good idea.
I'm going to prove to you that science depends upon philosophy. Easy. I have a PhD. What does that stand for?
Philosophe Doctor, which, fun fact, is why the P and the D are capitalized, but not the H. The H is just part of the philosophi.
I have a doctor of what philosophy? What philosophy is the underlying philosophy that draws all of evolutionary science? What is it? It's called naturalism.
Nope. The philosophy naturalism doesn't drive science. Many scientists are not philosophical naturalists. In fact, it's methodological naturalism that drives science, because assuming miracles are a significant factor cuts us off from making any conclusions on the basis of empirical results, and you yourself know that this is silly because you said this.
What if science was just a way of thinking that might help to explain things? So one way of thinking is Zeus is standing on top of a mountaintop, and he's got his lightning bolt ready, and when I get out my petri dish and I do an experiment, he's going to either zap my lightning bolt or not zap my lightning bolt. That is a way of thinking. It's not really very conducive to science, is it? Ism is a belief, right?
Sometimes, but not always. There are things like atavism, altruism, botulism, escapism, embolism, euphemism, gigantism, dwarfism, exorcism, biblicism, masochism, mentalism, angelicism, cretinism, catabolism, chimerism, tourism, journalism, metabolism, nominalism, alcoholism, bipedalism, dimorphism, literalism, anachronism, athleticism, bilingualism, terrorism, baptism, hermaphroditism, autism, cannibalism, magnetism, neologism, etc. It's really more of a state or existence. Atheism is the state of rejecting gods. Theism is accepting gods. Jingoism is the state of being aggressively patriotic, etc. So I guess we're off to a bad start already.
Theism, belief in God. Naturalism, it's a belief in the natural world.
No, it's belief that the natural world is all that exists. If it were simply belief in the natural world, then nearly everyone, theist or not, would be a naturalist. But further, it's also used in the sense of methodological naturalism to mean lack of consideration of things outside the natural world, regardless of belief.
It's the belief that natural processes can explain everything.
Nope, in the context of science, it's the practice of only allowing for natural explanations, because science is specifically an investigation of how the natural world operates.
My doctorate is in a philosophy of no God.
More natural philosophy, which while not rejecting supernatural agents, simply doesn't attempt to account for them or use them as explanations, because those are not useful to the investigation of how the natural world operates naturally.
You catch that? Absolutely, that is the underlying philosophy underneath the pursuit of modern science.
Weird then how many scientists are philosophical supernaturalists while remaining steadfast methodological naturalists in their work.
What is evolution then?
In this context is the biological theory explaining the patterns and emergence of biological diversity in populations over time.
I'm a biologist, right? But I'm not an evolutionist. What's a biologist? He's someone who studies life.
By that definition, I would argue that you are not a biologist, because frankly, Bobby, may I call you Bobby? From what I've seen of you, you just get basic facts wrong. So basic that I have trouble attributing it to ignorance in a PhD in biology. And then you try to convince Christians that they're right for absurdly bad reasons.
I study living things, and I can't get enough of it. I'm not even scratched the surface of what's there. It is an amazing occupation to be in. If you ever want to become a biologist, you're going to be poor the rest of your life, but you're going to have a really good time. So I would encourage you, enjoy life.
Don't lie about science.
If you take biology, say this is biology, and you add to it the philosophy of naturalism, you naturally get evolution.
No, evolution is what happens when you look at the evidence of biology without already having rejected it. That's why virtually all Christian and otherwise theist biologists, in fact, accept it. See, what you're doing here, Bob, is creating a false dichotomy. It's creations versus atheists. First, atheists don't have a monopoly on not being Christian. We have Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Muslims, and Jews, just name a few. This isn't a fight between atheists and Christians, it's a fight between those who are honest with the data and those who are not. You're not on the honest side.
Evolution is simply the outworking. It's trying to explain life using only natural causes.
Hey, remember when you said that invoking a supernatural agent in your experiment was silly? Because I remember...
What if science was just a way of thinking that might help to explain things? So one way of thinking is Zeus is standing on top of a mountaintop, and he's got his lightning bolt ready, and when I get out my petri dish and I do an experiment, he's going to either zap my lightning bolt or not zap my lightning bolt. That is a way of thinking. It's not really very conducive to science, is it?
It still doesn't get less silly because the one you evoke just happens to be the one you believe in.
Now, I would call myself a biblical creationist.
Cool, but so would Hugh Ross, and so would many of the folks at Biologos, the big name in Christian theistic evolution. But you don't get a monopoly on biblical interpretation, nor do your buddies at CMI. I want to recount something I heard from Todd Wood. Unfortunately, I'm having trouble finding it, so if you don't want to believe he said it or said something like it, that's fine. It's the idea that matters. He wrote a book with Daryl R. Falk called The Fool and the Heretic. Falk is a theistic evolutionist, and the book is about their mutual interaction in terms of trying to earnestly interpret the Bible and look at science both on its own and in the context of their Christian faith. I haven't read the book, but I did look at some point at the promotional stuff that Wood made about it, because the topic is interesting to me. One of the things that Wood said is that in interacting with those Christians outside the young earth creationist camp, he would often in exasperation say that the big reason he believes as he does is that he's just trying to take the Bible seriously. But they would reply that they were too. At first he didn't believe them, but as he got to know them, got to see how seriously they took their religious convictions, as well as how much time they would often spend studying not just science but the Bible, he realized that they were right. They were not taking the text of the Bible less seriously. They were indeed honestly convinced differently than he was. Taking the mantle of biblical on oneself in this matter is just arrogant.
What does that mean? It means I take biology, the study of life, and I add my views of God.
So do the fine folks at Biologos, Robbie. So do they.
Theism. And you get creation out of that. Now, there's different views of God, there's different understandings of God, and there's different types of theism, there's different types of creationism. There's young earth creationists like me, there's old earth creationists, there's evolutionary creationists, even though that's an oxymoron, a contradictory terms, they call themselves evolutionary creationists.
That's why I prefer the term theistic evolution. The ship has sailed on creationism commonly being used to cover any sort of theistic accounts of origins, and I think them trying to claw back the word is futile.
There's lots of different ways to approach this because there's lots of different views of God. Okay so far?
Yes, I'm okay. Thanks for asking.
Okay, what's evolution?
Evolution is the theory in biology that explains how organisms change and diversify over time in response to factors such as natural and sexual selection, genetic drift, etc. One of its findings is that the most parsimonious reconstruction of the history of life is that all so far discovered life shares common ancestry. The minimum that counts as evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population of biological organisms from one generation to the next.
Have you ever heard it defined, evolution is just change over time?
Yeah, and like dictionaries, when talking about the word outside the context of biology.
I heard that in just about every college class I was ever in.
Before they actually gave the biological definition, I assume.
That is the stupidest definition of evolution you can possibly imagine. No, sorry, not stupidest. It's the lamest definition of evolution that you can imagine.
No, it's just the basic definition of the word in English outside of specialist contexts. Sorry that you don't like that English has words that are polysemous and different registers. I don't know, go learn a language that doesn't, like ichthywheel or something. No, don't go learn ichthywheel, it's probably impossible, just get over it.
Why? Because I believe in change over time. But I don't believe in evolution.
Actually, based on other stuff I've seen from you, you do believe in evolution. But I'm sure we'll get there, so let's not jump the gun.
All the change that Darwin saw is change. Yeah, okay, that happens. Yep, that happens. Sure enough, that happens too. Okay, got it. Where's the evolution? Why? Why am I not an evolutionist? I've had a lot of people say, oh, you believe in change? Ha-ha, you're an evolutionist. No, I'm not. Because what if the change goes back and forth?
Then it's evolution. That already happens in populations under selection pressure from medium to long-term climate cycles like El Nino and La Nina cycles in the Pacific.
What if it goes in a circle? What if it goes downhill?
You'd have to clarify what you mean by that. But if either involves a change to allele frequencies over generations, then they're evolution.
Change in itself is not evolution. Evolution has to have upward change.
Says who? Most people who reject it? That's what we call a straw man. Also, I like how we haven't defined upward. Near as I can tell, you just mean change I emotionally like. Well, guess what? Nature is under no obligation to make you happy.
And that upward change, if you go back in time, should trace back, all life should trace back to a common ancestor.
Not really. Turns out it does. But there was no guarantee. Evolution would be just as true if life on Earth had some other number of origins than one. If it had turned out that, say, bacteria were not related to archaea and eukaryotes, that wouldn't invalidate all of evolution. And of course, evolution would predict that if we were to find an alien biosphere, it almost certainly would not share any common ancestry with Earth life.
Evolution is the belief in the common ancestry of all things.
Only in that it is a hypothesis based on evolution that has turned out to be very well supported. It's not a core part of the idea that all life have common ancestry with all other life. It just turns out that that's how it seems.
Oh, but you'll never hear it defined that way. Why? Because you can observe change. You can't observe common ancestry.
I mean, you can. Look, here are a list of papers reporting speciation events, which is in fact watching common ancestry. Plus, just like how you can observe paternity in a paternity test, you can observe common ancestry. In fact, that's exactly how it works. In order to say that such genetic tests do not display common ancestry, you'd have to come up with a reason why the techniques that work for parent and offspring do not also work for cousins, or at least how far apart cousinhood can be inferred, and why. Near as I can tell, no one has even tried to propose such a way to tell when genetic testing of this sort stops working. And on top of that, there's the fact that even if it's not observable, it makes predictions which routinely come true, including in fields such as medicine, genetics, and paleontology. Those confirmed testable predictions are in fact what some might call the gold standard in science.
Good trick, huh?
There's no trick. All of this is pretty open. No one is hiding something about the definition or the conclusions of evolution. The fact that it might not always filter down correctly to lay people is more of a problem with science reporting and communication than with some kind of dishonesty.
The Bible, in the first chapter, makes some very radical claims about history. The Bible, in that first chapter, claims that God created the entire universe in 6 consecutive 24-hour-ish. I say ish because the first day there's no light yet. How can I count anything? But as soon as there's light, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning, evening, morning. 6 times it says that. Evening and morning, there was 1 day, 2 day, third day, 4th day.
I just want to remind you and my audience that your interpretation of Genesis is not the only one Christians hold in good faith. Nor are any such interpretations important to science. If science happens to contradict your personal interpretation of Genesis, that's not grounds for change to science on its own. It might be motivation for you to try and find evidence to change science, but the account in Genesis is not that evidence, and even less so is your interpretation of it.
You know, linguistically, the writer of Genesis painted a box, and you can't escape that box.
You know, linguistically, I have no evidence that you speak Hebrew at all, Dr. Carter. So, because I don't really care about your interpretation of Genesis or your takes on Hebrew, I'm going to skip until you're done talking about it.
Let's talk about natural selection. You've heard the phrase natural selection, right?
Yes, I have.
Do you know what it is? Do you know what it means? Let me read you something from Charles Darwin himself. Now, this is 1800s writing, and Charles Darwin, basically, he's got long sections in German in his book because, everyone knows German, right?
I'm going to need a citation. Because as far as I know, none of Darwin's published works make any significant use of German. In fact, Darwin wasn't much of a linguist. He hated Latin and Greek and was passable at French, and according to his son Francis, he was horrible at German and could only read it with the help of a dictionary, and he read it exceptionally slowly and never learned to pronounce it. Let's just hear from Francis himself in his book, Life and Letters of Charles Darwin. Much of his scientific reading was in German, and this was a serious labor to him. In reading a book after him, I was often struck at seeing, from the pencil marks made each day where he had left off, how little he could read at a time. He used to call German the verdammt, pronounced as if in English. He was especially indignant with Germans because he was convinced that they could write simply if they chose, and often praised Professor Hildebrand of Freiburg for writing German which was actually as clear as French. He sometimes gave a German sentence to a friend, a patriotic German lady, and used to laugh at her if she did not translate it fluently. He himself learnt German simply by hammering away with a dictionary. He would say that his only way was to read a sentence a great many times over, and at last the meaning occurred to him. When he began German long ago, he boasted of the fact, as he used to tell, to Sir J. Hooker, who replied, "Ah, my dear fellow, that's nothing. I have begun it many times." In spite of his want of grammar, he managed to get on wonderfully with German, and the sentences that he failed to make out were generally difficult ones. He never attempted to speak German correctly, but pronounced the words as though they were English, and this made it not a little difficult to help him when he read out a German sentence and asked for a translation. He certainly had a bad ear for vocal sounds, so he found it impossible to perceive small differences in pronunciation. End quote. In fact, after searching, albeit briefly, through The Origin of Species, the only German I can find is references to works in German or by Germans. I can't find any actual text by Darwin in the language. This also fits in with the fact that despite having been sent a copy of Das Kapital by Karl Marx in German, he apparently never opened more than the front cover, as all the pages were uncut at the time of his death. So, Dr. Carter, either produce this long section in German, or stop spouting nonsense about Darwin. Of course, all of this is irrelevant, because Darwin is not a prophet of science. Science doesn't have prophets. No one really cares in the year of our Lord 2022 what Darwin wrote, or said, except for historical reasons.
What, aren't you educated? You don't know German? Oh, I don't know German either. But he has a very thick style of writing. So let me parse this and see if we can understand it. He says,
You might think that this block of English text is translated from a German section of one of Darwin's books, maybe Origin of Species or Descent of Man. Nope, it's from his book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, and the text is in English, not German. I have no idea why you're just making this German thing up, Dr. Carter, unless you just credulously heard it from your colleagues. If that's the case, may I suggest to you that it is evidence that the company you keep is of low moral character when it comes to honesty, and that perhaps you disassociate yourself from them.
if then, organic beings, or living things, in a state of nature, vary even in a slight degree. Catch that phrase, a slight degree.
Don't worry, I caught it. Go on.
If in the long course of ages, in other words, we add magic millions of years,
Nice poisoning of the well, but the age of the Earth being at least a minimum of millions of years is a firm outcome of basic physics and geology. If you want to deny it, then you're going to have to build a whole new model of particle physics. Good luck with that. And let's remember that when the rate team from ICR tried to debunk radiometric dating, they couldn't. They came up with such amazing conclusions as that the amount of decay they needed would generate enough heat to, and I quote, vaporize the rocks completely. And they proposed such unusual mechanisms as, again, quoting here, a sudden expansion of the fabric of space. And in their final conclusions in Volume 2, Chapter 10, they state, the removal of heat was so rapid it likely involved processes other than conduction, convection, or radiation. For example, the cooling of granite plutons would have taken thousands of years by conventional thermal diffusion. Of course, God was directly involved in all of these events, so it's possible that he employed some supernatural process which does not occur today, or cannot be detected, end quote. I'm not sure if it's necessary to tell you, Dr. Carter, but conduction, convection, and radiation are basically the only games in town unless you want to invoke magic, which remember, you said was silly.
what if science was just a way of thinking that might help to explain things? So one way of thinking is Zeus is standing on top of a mountaintop, and he's got his lightning bolt ready, and when I get out my petri dish and I do an experiment, he's going to either zap my lightning bolt or not zap my lightning bolt. That is a way of thinking. It's not really very conducive to science, is it? Inheritable variations arise in any way advantageous to any being under excessively complex and changing relations of life. Oh man, how do you read this stuff?
I say this at the danger of being a bit too rude, but just try not being pathetic. Sorry that a sentence with a few too many clauses is too much for you, doctor.
What he's saying is the environment is really complicated.
Which, it is.
And he's saying, give me something where, this hair is a little bit longer, this dog is just a tiny little bit smaller, bigger, blacker, or whiter, whatever variation you want. Then the severe and often recurrent struggle for existence will determine that those variations, however slight, which are favorable shall be preserved or selected, and those which are unfavorable shall be destroyed. I know that was hard to read, but is that kind of like your view of natural selection?
Pretty much.
Little teeny variation, give it enough time, and eventually, nature will sort itself out. It doesn't work this way.
Odd coming from someone who relies on natural selection to get all the extant species of much fewer species on the ark. You better hope it works that way on steroids, or it's going to be a big problem for your ark. Not that the ark doesn't already have basically infinite problems that preclude a literalist view of the story from being true already. This is just one of the more obvious ones.
He was actually completely wrong. Let me give you an example. Let's say I had a twin brother. My twin brother looks like Adonis. I look like me. Nah, of course we both look like Adonis. Duh. But see, what I didn't tell you is I was born, that's not true. Let's say I was born without toes.
Very unlikely if you're identical twins. And if you're not, then that's probably due to a difference in genetics. But go on.
I have no toes on my feet. He's got normal feet. Now we're out picking berries in the woods and a bear jumps out. Which one of us gets eaten?
Ceteris paribus, probably you.
What if he's half blind?
Then it's a different scenario, you dunce. Don't invalidate your own hypothetical. Just get to the point.
What if I've got real good hearing?
Then it's a different scenario, you dunce. Don't invalidate your own hypothetical. Just get to the point.
Which I don't, but what if I did? What if, I'm really self-conscious about my toes, and so I run marathons every day just because I want to show the world that I can walk normal, and he's just a, couch potato.
What if giving infinite caveats after you set up the hypothetical is stupid because it invalidates the whole point of thought experiments?
What if the bear jumped off on the left side of the path instead of the right side of the path?
Then non-ceteris paribus, so who cares?
Dumb luck.
By Jove, you've done it, Doctor! You've discovered that there are probabilistic aspects to evolutionary theory. We must send word to the papers at once, and of course the Academy will want to hear of this. Except, oh wait, everyone knew about this. It's part of genetic drift. But in the long run, since reproductive success is probabilistic and being well adapted gives an organism a higher chance but not a guarantee, it's not a long-term problem for natural selection, because selection pressure occurs regardless of the probabilistic aspects of evolution. Now, does it mean that some beneficial mutations won't make it? Yeah, but we knew that too.
You see, even something as extreme as toelessness, natural selection can't see it.
Yes, it absolutely can, because while we can come up with a whole host of just-so stories, where it's not a big enough problem to eliminate one from the environment, those are not going to be repeated across the population with enough regularity. Therefore, the underlying maladaptive nature of having no toes, which you yourself assumed in order for this whole thought experiment to work, will with high probability be selected against. This is to do with the law of large numbers. If I flip a coin, everyone knows that I have a 50-50 chance of getting heads or tails. So let's say I flip it 4 times. The most likely outcome is 2 tails and 2 heads, but the chance of, say, 4 heads is 1 in 16. Not exactly a miraculous occurrence. In fact, even the intuitive answer of 2 heads and 2 tails has a chance of less than 50%, with the actual odds being 37.5%. But let's give ourselves a couple million coin tosses. At this point, the likelihood of deviating from the expected statistical average of 50% heads and 50% tails by a significant amount becomes extremely low, and it is lower and lower the more times we flip the coin. Overall, the more attempts at something with a probabilistic outcome one makes, the closer to the actual probabilistic distribution the whole set is going to be. So sure, you can be dishonest, Robert, and go with an example of 1, but we know that when you expand to a population of thousands or millions, or in the case of humans, billions, these weird little quirks are going to even out. And so if a feature truly is advantageous in the environment, it will likely spread, and if it's actually maladaptive, it will likely die out.
There's too many confounding factors in nature that influence whether or not you live or die based on that trait.
Once again, the law of large numbers solves this quite neatly. Even if a trait confers only a small advantage to an individual, one which can fairly easily be negated by luck, luck evens out over many individuals and many lifetimes.
There's traits that interact with each other, the environment is interacting, and then there's just, you get struck by a meteor and I don't get struck by a meteor. I mean, what can you do?
Nothing. But that's why evolution is fundamentally a phenomenon that happens at the population level, not the individual level. And population genetics is a fundamentally statistical field. So these hypothetical individual interactions aren't really important. This is like asking how can an ant colony work together by means of chemical signals when you can easily take an ant and crush it, and now it can't signal anything to anyone. Well, in fact, it works because only a small proportion of the ants are subject to random, unavoidable death. So on the whole, the statistics of the colony dictate that it will likely manage to survive just fine. And it would take a systematic and high-frequency death rate to cause a breakdown in this organization, which does occur. Right now you're looking at such a thing, an ant death spiral. But on the whole, we notice that despite the fact that any one ant may very well indeed meet an untimely death, and that colony lose its particular signaling capacity, we see ant colonies being extremely successful all over the Earth. Sometimes, much to our chagrin.
There's too much noise in the system.
You get a citation for that because it's odd that no one who does this for a living who hasn't already decided to not take the evidence seriously seems to have come to that conclusion.
Back in Grandpa's day, the car, when you turn the radio on, you had these buttons that you'd push and this little thing would move and try to catch the signal. And then when you kind of caught it, you take your dial and you go, because they didn't have this thing called digital yet. It was all analog.
Yeah, that's why we say you tune into a radio station, because you had to tune the receiver to the right frequency with a knob or a dial. Which is also why radio hosts sometimes tell you not to touch that dial. Hooray for words!
And sometimes you get a station, and you'd be like, and oh, that's my favorite song. You'd be like, and then every once in a while you catch a word or two. What's the problem with this? There's too much noise. You weren't close enough to the radio station to get a good signal. And you know what? Even if you knew what song was being played, if there's too much noise, you would never hear it. You could listen to it for 1,000,000 years and you would never hear your song if there's too much noise.
Well, natural selection isn't a receiver attempting to decode a signal, so this is a bad analogy. And you should feel bad about it. Natural selection is simply the observation that if a particular genotype results in a phenotype that causes organisms with it to, on average, have more offspring who themselves survive to reproduce than other organisms, then over time that genotype will come to predominate, and eventually fix in a population.
Darwin didn't understand that.
Well, he didn't understand radios, that's true, but he probably would have looked at you like an idiot if you had told him that natural selection was a receiver for a signal, so I don't know what to tell you.
He said, give me millions of years and nature will sort the noise out and that trait will naturally rise up, but it doesn't happen.
It manifestly does. We can see it now and in the lab, like when a new parasite entered the Hawaiian Islands that tracked crickets by sound. Different populations of crickets became silent as the parasitic flies spread. And the different populations used different genetic mechanisms to do it, so it wasn't simply a pre-programmed adaptation. Or the whole point of the long-term Lenski-Escherichia coli experiment is to show that the effects of natural selection and the importance of contingency on it. And we've seen lots of adaptations and increases in fitness, or we can see it in modern works on the beaks of Darwin's finches, that have also responded to climate cycles via natural selection. You can make whatever arguments you want against the sky being blue, but everyone can just step outside on a clear day and take a look themselves.
Plus, natural selection is not evolution.
Correct in the same way that a wing isn't an airplane. It's a big part of it, though.
People were writing about natural selection a long time before Charles Darwin wrote about it.
Were any of them the prophet of science? No, they weren't. Okay then, who cares?
This man is named Edward Blythe. Now, I don't think he was a young earth creationist, if you would, but he was definitely a special creationist. He definitely believed that God created the universe and created life. He wrote several papers, which I've read. They are brilliant. In 1835, Charles Darwin was born. He was in his 20s when these were written. In fact, Charles Darwin was on the Beagle going around the world as a young man when this man wrote Natural Selection, the whole thing.
Dude, you need to get to a point that matters to science. This is history, and don't get me wrong, as a guy with a history degree, I find that personally interesting. But nothing about it is going to change modern science.
But in his model, natural selection was the thing that God used to purify species and get rid of the weak and get rid of the lame and keep things from going extinct.
Sounds like that's right up your alley, so what's the problem?
Darwin said, oh no, natural selection is that thing that evolves species.
Oh, you're gonna lie about Darwin again like you did last time. He didn't say that it was sufficient on its own, it also required inheritance of new variations. His problem was that neither he nor anyone else at the time knew how new traits and variations came about.
So the idea wasn't Darwin's.
It's almost like who came up with an idea first ultimately doesn't matter in science.
Let me give you an example of natural selection. This is from Evolution's Achilles heels. Let's see if my video works here. Yeah, oh, there it is, okay. We got two bacteria. We got a mutant one on the right here. It's kind of shriveled up. It's got a little teeny pore and an antibiotic. That purple thing can't get in. Some of the food can't get in. But the normal bacteria, the food gets in and the antibiotic gets in. Oh, who dies in that situation?
The normal or wild-type bacterium. But good to know that you do think natural selection works. Not sure why you spent so much time trying to say it didn't. Just checking again. Let me know if it's massive and inexcusable incompetence or just normal old dishonesty.
The degenerate one lives? Yeah.
It's almost like the fitness value of traits is dependent on the environment, which, you know, has been a big theme in evolutionary biology since the beginning and isn't news to anyone in the field.
Most every example of natural selection that we've seen in the world, in the laboratory, in the natural world, is natural selection acting on something that's broken.
Sure, icefish have antifreeze because of broken blood proteins. Humans can walk upright in part thanks to broken tail genes. Tetrapods have limbs because of broken fin genes. Humans have big brains because of broken tumor suppressor genes. Elephants have tusks because of broken incisor genes. So what? But also, this is simply not true in all cases. For example, at all levels of taxonomy, organisms have orphan genes, genes which were not inherited from ancestors before the common ancestors of the other organisms with the orphan gene in the question. That means these genes are de novo and did not break anything else. So even though most organisms can be assessed as a, quote, broken version of something else, you know, if you want to act like an idiot, it's still not true broadly. In fact, in a couple specific examples of the CIT+ line of E. coli in the Lenski experiment, they duplicated both an enzymatic section and an aerobic promoter region without breaking anything else to allow them to aerobically metabolize citrate. Similarly, in lactose-tolerant humans, lactase persistence is due to a strengthening of the function of the lactase promoter region. Nothing broke.
Let's see. A lot of you cannot digest lactose. That is the normal state. The closer your ancestors were either to Eastern Africa or Scandinavia, the more likely you are able to digest lactose as an adult.
Neat. I just use this as an example.
I can't. I'm not a mutant. There's a gene that, because lactose is in mother's milk.
Hence the name from Latin lac, genitive form lactis, meaning milk, and the ending OSE, meaning sugar, so the sugar of milk. John, if you're watching this and you know who you are, it's logical, probable, and plausible that you've gotten this wrong in the past, so maybe fix yourself so you sound less like a dummy next time you're asked about ribose.
And as an adult, you don't need it anymore. So, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, that gene switches off. There's an off switch. But in some people, the switch is broken.
Wrong. Once again, Dr. Carter, I would like you to clarify if you just don't know any better because you're incompetent and can't do your job properly, or if you're just a liar. I wonder how many more times I'll have to ask that. Probably a lot. There is no switch that turns off lactase. Instead, what actually happens is that the lactase promoter is relatively weak in most humans, meaning that while it is still active in life, it competes with much more strongly promoted genes in the digestive tract, meaning that late in life, if lactase is made at all, it is not in sufficient amounts to digest lactose late in life. Lactase persistence actually strengthens the promotion of lactase, more than doubling it, allowing it to successfully compete for transcription and production late in life. This isn't exactly a new or controversial finding. This has been known for almost 20 years. So, Dr. Carter, did you just forget to actually read up on this and then just pretend that since you had already made a false claim that all of evolution is breaking things, that this would just fit your assertion? If so, I applaud you for making a prediction, but you have to check on those. Or did you actually look into it, realize it didn't fit with your ideas, and then just decide to lie about it? Neither is a good look, but there aren't that many other options.
And what does that do? It allows you to eat a nutritious, fatty, protein-rich food called cow's milk.
Well, that, but also lots of other milks are consumed by humans, including goat, sheep, camel, yak, reindeer, and horse.
As adults, and it's really good for you in some ways, if otherwise you would be starving.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of how food works. It's really good for you if you otherwise wouldn't have it.
But that doesn't happen. Here's another example. Sickle cell anemia is endemic in Central Africa. Sickle cell anemia is a paralyzing, horrible, no good, bad, terrible disease.
If you're homozygous for it, sure.
It hurts to have sickle cell anemia because under low oxygen conditions, the hemoglobin in your blood cells forms crystals. And those crystals, they get lodged in your joints and stuff. And it's just, you actually usually die pretty young if you've got sickle cell anemia. But if you're just a carrier,
there's no such thing as a carrier for sickle cell. You're either homozygous or heterozygous. Sickle cell is a codominant trait. Only recessive traits have carriers, that is, people with the allele but who are not affected by it. Because it's codominant with one sickle cell allele and one normal allele, you have an intermediate genotype with normal blood cell shapes but odd hemoglobin. But it's not odd enough that it usually causes early mortality.
You're still not as healthy as normal people, but your blood's still sickle, and they tear apart the malaria parasites that live inside red blood cells.
Dude, stop making stuff up. That's not even something I can find proposed. Sickle-shaped blood cells aren't actually sickles. They're not chopping up malaria parasites. Also, if you only have sickle cell trait, your cell shapes are normal anyway. Where did you even get that idea? The actual mechanism isn't known, but one of the current best hypotheses is that the parasite has a harder time attaching to the cell membrane of sickle-affected blood cells, so it has a harder time eating. Meaning that it can't make you as sick, so your immune system has time to clear the infection before you die because your symptoms are weaker. Another well-supported idea is that the hemoglobin forms complexes that trap the parasite, to the same basic effect. And it's not like getting this right would have weakened anything about your point. You just chose to go with something so inane that as near as I can tell, no one has ever proposed it. The cells aren't actually sickle-shaped in heterozygous people. Maybe you didn't mean that, but it sure sounds like it.
So if you carry that trait, you're much more likely to survive to adulthood and have babies.
Yep, within the context of a high prevalence of malaria, it's a pretty big advantage, and we see that it has spread through much of the population. Almost like natural selection works. Which, remember, you seemed to think it didn't earlier. Thanks for contradicting your previous self from this very talk.
And yet it stinks to have it.
Evolution doesn't care about your happiness.
But you know what? If you got a choice of having malaria or being in pain, which one is better?
I can't answer that for other people, but I can say that in terms of natural selection, sickle trait is going to leave people with more offspring. But also, let's talk about the fact that we're talking about sickle cell trait, not sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is what you have if you are homozygous for sickle cell. Those are the ones who typically don't live long enough to reproduce anyway. If you have sickle cell trait, that is, you only have one sickle cell allele, then you generally don't have any symptoms at all. So we negate basically everything about this, other than the bare fact that sickle cell trait causes malaria resistance, wrong.
Being in pain. As far as, because evolution, okay, I should have said this earlier. Do you all understand that evolution has nothing to do with survival?
Well, you have to survive long enough to reproduce, so it has something to do with it.
I've actually been using natural selection incorrectly here. I meant to explain it a little better.
And there's our first glimmer of self-awareness.
Natural selection has nothing to do with life or death. Natural selection is all about having babies.
Well, that's why real scientists talk about differential reproductive success and reproductive fitness.
You don't have to live or die. You could just have more than the other person.
Fun fact, you have to be alive to make new babies.
Example, imagine that there's a mountain, and the mountain is covered with oak trees. And it's really dry at the top of the mountain. At the base of the mountain, there's a river. So the ground down here is wet, and the ground up here is really parched all the time. And within this oak tree species, there's a diversity of genes. Some of the genes help the oak tree like dry conditions, and some of the genes help oak trees tolerate wet roots. Fair enough?
No, because how the heck did the oak tree get whole new genes? You're the anti-evolutionist. Surely what you mean is alleles. But of course, if that's what you meant, why wouldn't you say it? Dr. Carter, biologist.
Now, give yourself several hundred years. Generation after generation after generation of oak trees.
Okay.
Which oak tree is going to produce more acorns on the top of the hill? The one that likes wet roots or dry roots?
Once again, ceteris paribus, dry roots. But based on how this went last time, I'm expecting you to immediately invalidate your own hypothetical because you've so far displayed the intellectual honesty of a Hovind.
The one that likes dry roots. Generations later, which genes are going to be better represented up there?
Alleles, but it'll be alleles that provide advantages in dry conditions.
The genes that like dry roots. In fact, over time, the genes are going to sort themselves on the slope. It has nothing to do with death.
Does that have something to do with life, though? The oldest trees will start to die off. Oak trees aren't immortal, last time I checked.
Natural selection is a really, really bad term. First of all, nature doesn't select.
Whoa, you figured out that the term anthropomorphizes nature. Gold star! That's some, 5th grade reading skills you get right there, little Bobby. Well done.
Nature's not alive.
The living parts of it are.
What's another term you've heard?
Subduction.
Survival of the fittest. That's also a really bad term, because who's the fittest?
It's a bad term, and it was invented not to describe biological evolution, but the social theory inspired by it, social Darwinism. And fitness is measured by reproductive success, usually grandchildren who survive to reproduce, which yes, makes the term tautological, which is why it's a bad term that neither I nor the biologists I know use.
Is the biggest, the strongest, the fastest?
It's context dependent. In some cases, yes, in others, no. But it's always the ones with the most long-term reproductive success.
The one with the best eyesight? No, it's the one who has the most number of children.
Correct. That's another gold star.
You know, World War I was fought on Darwinian terms. Did you know that?
Not only did I not know that, I think it's impossible to know that, because I'm pretty confident it's nonsense.
The powers that be wanted their armies to fight, to get rid of all the weaklings.
Yeah, I'm sure a complex web of secret alliances had nothing to do with it. And even if it had been the whole motive of the war to weed out weaklings, we're back to social Darwinism, not evolutionary biology.
So their race would be stronger. Did you realize that? World War II, that's exactly what the Germans were doing. World War II in Germany wasn't just about getting rid of Jewish people. It was getting rid of the weak Germans so the Germans would be stronger.
Oh, so now we're just going into World War II with no segue? I guess that and the First World War were basically the same conflict, and the Roma, and any resident people of African descent. It was getting rid of a lot of people. But here's the thing, the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party thought that his own, quote, race was superior, and his eugenics didn't need Darwin when it had the example of selective breeding of domesticated animals, which long predates Darwin. But even if we grant that he got every last idea from Darwin, what's your point? Argument from consequences is a fallacy for a reason. If someone tells you your house is on fire, saying, that can't be true, my family is in there, doesn't somehow make your house not on fire. So even if belief in evolution were the sole cause of all the bad things from the 20th century until the end of time, that wouldn't make it wrong. Also, of course, we have the ever-present appeal to the NSDAP. Guess what? The leader of that movement also liked dogs, being a vegetarian, and he hated smoking. So if you agree with him on those, then you're evil too. Except, no, that's not how that works. Things aren't evil by association with evil regimes, and they're not good by having been opposed by them. Unless, of course, you, as a Christian, Dr. Carter, would like to just embrace subjective and relative morality. I'd love to hear your reasoning on that.
It is nothing, it's really, just use a life and death example again. It's not life and death. It's he who has the most number of children wins.
Basically, but we've already made this point, and no one that I know of is disputing it, so let's move on.
Oh, that's oh man, I'm going to jump to the morality section here. I skip everything here. I'm not going to finish my talk. I'm just going to have to end at the end. Whatever, it's fun. Margaret Sanger.
Founder of Planned Parenthood, and yes, a eugenicist who wanted to largely get rid of non-white people, and yes, strategically tried to make it easier for them to get abortions in the hopes of reducing the relative abundance of their genetics in the USA. Still just an argument from consequences.
My dear friend, Dr. John Sanford, he came up with an idea. It's an idea called genetic entropy. What is entropy?
Entropy is a statistical phenomenon in which, over time, isolated systems tend to have the same or less energy in the system available to do work. It is also the fact that over time, the macrostates of a system tend to adopt forms that can be achieved by ever larger numbers of quantum microstates. It is measured in joules per Kelvin.
It's the idea that all things are decaying over time, right? Well,
no, it's not, and I suspect that you know that because I seriously doubt that you managed to get a PhD in marine biology while being that stupid. But once again, if I'm wrong about that, and instead of just being a massive liar, you are stupid, Dr. Carter, please contact me and let me know. You can just send an email as simple as, Dear Mr. Dinosaur, I am in fact a complete idiot, yours, Dr. Carter. At that point, I will keep dishonesty and malice off the table when discussing your work in the future.
The DNA, the genome, it's part of life, right? It should be decaying also.
Except it isn't. We can confirm this with paleogenomics as well as laboratory experiments. There is no actual evidence of genetic entropy outside the minds of creationists and the computer programs they designed specifically to show that it's totally real, you guys.
But see, natural selection is supposed to get rid of all those mutations, all that decay, and amplify the good stuff, and the species are supposed to go upward over time. But what if they didn't? What if they went downward over time?
They'd go extinct, which can happen in small populations. It's called an extinction vortex, and it's actually kind of the opposite of genetic entropy. So it doesn't help much, but let's talk about it anyway. Genetic entropy is the idea that some mutations are harmful, but only slightly, to the point that they are not actually going to be selected against, and therefore will persist in a population. Eventually, as the population continues to exist, the buildup of these nearly neutral but harmful mutations causes the overall fitness of the population to decline until it is driven to extinction. So this requires a lot of mutation and hence lots of genetic diversity. Now, this is stupid for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is that we can't observe it anywhere. But also, just in terms of basic math. Because these mutations are by definition increasing genetic diversity, the population undergoing this process must be internally diverse, meaning that only some individuals will go above this fitness decline threshold, where they no longer are fit enough to survive and reproduce. But the other portions of the population will survive. Also, since all point mutations are in fact reversible, it is mathematically impossible to accumulate harmful mutations indefinitely. At some point, the chances of having a back mutation to the less harmful allele will equal the chance of further harmful mutations, meaning that a population will reach an equilibrium. Last, the whole thing relies on an internal misuse of the work of pioneering Japanese geneticist Moto Kimura, who invented the field of neutral theory, which focuses on tracing evolution through mutations that have no effect on selection. In his work, he said that because any beneficial mutations would be so strongly selected for that it would overwhelm his statistics, he was going to pretend that they didn't exist. Sanford thought he could then just pretend that means that Moto Kimura was ignoring them because they largely didn't exist. That's just a lie. Sanford is either lying about having read Kimura's work, or he's lying about what that work says. Or I guess he has the intelligence of a recently stepped on sea cucumber. So what is an extinction vortex? Well, it's a result of a decline in diversity. If a population is very small, or if it is very low in diversity, it can be difficult to avoid new members of the population being homozygous for genetic diseases, and to avoid the fixation of harmful alleles simply due to genetic drift before selection can weed them out. As a result, these populations are vulnerable to both genetic diseases and opportunistic pathogen diseases, and are likely to go extinct. So for example, if you have a population of mammals that only numbers a few dozen, chances are good that they may be subject to an extinction vortex no matter how well a hypothetical breeding program for them goes.
What if they got worse over time? This idea called genetic entropy, that even given a Darwinist all the natural selection they want, it doesn't work. And here's why. If you're born without a head, you're not going to have any children.
Tell that to all the Nidarians.
What if you're born blue?
Depends on the environment.
Marry a blind person. Right? I mean, think of all the different things you could be born with and you're still perfectly able to have babies.
Okay, so the only place this is going in my brain is places that would risk the monetization of this video, so I'll just shut up.
Despite the fact that natural selection might get rid of the worst mutations, even the not so bad mutations, or sorry, not even, the not so bad mutations can't be seen by natural selection.
They can if they have a net negative effect on reproductive success. It's not a binary you're selected for or against, and you either have or don't have offspring. If being blue makes it so that on average blue individuals have 3.2 children, but non-blue individuals have on average 3.6 children, then guess what? Blue is being selected against as long as the environmental conditions causing that persist. And the minute a genome crosses over into less fit relative to the environment than others, it will be selected against while the others are not.
Because natural selection, as I said earlier, only deals with how many children you have. If the mutation doesn't affect procreation, it has nothing to do with evolution.
This remains both true and not helpful to your case.
And most mutations are so weak that natural selection can't see them.
In fact, most of them are completely neutral.
The signal is not strong enough to rise above the noise.
Oh, we're back to the bad analogy of natural selection being a radio antenna. It's still bad.
Let me show you a chart. This is from a paper that John Sanford and I published in 2012 in an evolutionary journal. Don't let anyone ever tell you that creationists can't publish, because we certainly do. They don't like us, but...
Creationists do indeed publish, it's just that when they do, one of two things happen. It's a bad paper that makes no impact other than people pointing out the problems, or it's entirely conventional and in no way helps out creationism. Spoilers, this one is of the first kind.
We were looking around for a system where we could study genetic entropy. We've had 10 years before this. We had 10 years of theory, of math, and computer modeling. And all of it pointed to genetic entropy being real.
Wait, you mean that the computer models that you created specifically with your bad assumptions like objective fitness, the possibility of indefinite deleterious mutations, etc., then show that your bad assumptions led to your dumb conclusion? Wow, that's so surprising.
But we needed to study it in life. The problem is you need something with lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of generations and data. And you can't do it for humans because, you know, we've got maybe 1,000 human genomes today, but they don't go back very far.
Well, unless you count those genomes from the ancient humans that go back farther than you think the Earth has existed and don't provide any support for genetic entropy. Whoops.
But what we found was the flu. Somebody dug up a body of a woman that was buried in Alaska in 1917. And it was so far north, they basically hacked a hole in the permafrost and covered her.
Okay, isn't that the start to a horror movie? Do people not watch horror movies anymore?
And her body had been frozen since 1917. And I said, oh, look at that. So they took a tissue biopsy and they found the influenza that killed her, and they sequenced the genome of the 1917 flu that killed more people than died in World War I.
A worse pandemic than the most recent one, and one in which mask mandates were in effect. Now I want to give you and your organization, Creation Ministries International, credit. You guys were staunchly pro-mask and pro-vaccine, and you took a lot of flack for it from your audience. But you guys stuck to your guns. I really hope, and I think it more likely than not, that at least some of your followers got vaccinated and wore masks when otherwise they would not have, and that saved their lives. But on the other hand, you guys had to fend off a lot of anti-science nut jobs who were your followers and who were appalled that you would be in favor of the vaccine and masks. And you guys just kept protesting that you were following the science. Now, what is it about your organization that would attract anti-science conspiracy theorists, do you suppose? Could it be that for you to be right, science would have to be both wrong about nearly everything, and there would have to be a massive conspiracy to hide that fact?
At the end of World War I, basically both armies stopped fighting because everybody was sick. You can't fight in the army if all your guys are laying on the ground and doing flu things. It's terrible stuff. But we had a 0 point, the initial outbreak of this influenza.
For genetic entropy to be true, shouldn't you need a perfect genome? So I guess sometime before 1917, God came down to create the perfect screw you to humanity virus and then let it decay away from there? Look, if that's the theology you want to go with, then have fun with it. But otherwise, that virus had to have evolved from previous viruses. So why did they manage to avoid genetic entropy and make this, according to you, supervirus?
And then we found all of these other sequences from the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s all the way up to the year 2009. And we said, wait a minute, this is 2012. How come there aren't any sequences of this flu in 2010 and 11 and 12?
They are. You included them in your paper.
The answer is, it went extinct.
No, you didn't. You yourself said so in figures 2 and 3.
Actually, it went extinct twice. It went extinct in 1957 the first time.
You can't really go extinct twice. If you're extinct, you're pretty well gone.
And then in 1976, on the Chinese side of the Manchurian border, it broke out again. But the flu that broke out was identical to flus that were circulating in Scandinavia in 1952. And then later on, someone in Moscow admitted that they opened up an old sample and the flu got out.
So not extinct. Extinct in the wild. Those aren't the same.
But why did it appear in China? Good question. Anyway, it's not biowarfare. They would never do something like that.
Sure they would. But is there evidence they did? Because this isn't sufficient on its own. There are valid research reasons to keep samples of old viruses that aren't biological warfare.
But that's the blue dots. The red dots are 1976 and beyond. And essentially what we discovered was that more than 10% of the DNA of the flu had mutated. But wait a second, the flu is under natural selection. You see, if you had the flu, the only flu viruses you can pass to that guy are the ones that have escaped your immune system. That's called natural selection.
He can be taught.
If you can't reproduce in someone else, you're dead. So only the biggest, strongest, and fastest flu viruses should be passed on, right? No. Because most of those mutations have nothing to do with the flu grabbing onto that little thing on your cell that it uses to get into the cell. It's like rust on a car. Eventually, every car you're driving today will fall apart to pieces. But a single little speck of rust doesn't do anything.
Cool, so you must have either measured fitness directly with things like eruption time or number of viral particles at eruption, or use a proxy like R0. Oh, no, you didn't? You used how often the virus used the same codon and sequences in its genome, and how sick it makes people. Neither of which come even close to approximating fitness. So we can't even say on the basis of your paper that fitness declined, no matter how many metaphors you make.
Millions of specks of rust send it to the junkyard. And basically, mutation in the genome is essentially things rusting out, one little thing at a time, and natural selection can't stop it. A car analogy, it would be like, oh, my tires are worn out. I'm going to slap new tires on my car. I'm going to give myself a tune-up, change the oil.
Those are important aspects of automotive care, yes.
That's what natural selection might, because if you don't change your oil, your car is going to poop out pretty quickly, right? If you don't put new tires in your car, what, are you going to get 100,000 miles if you're really, really lucky? If you don't hit any nails? But point is, natural selection doesn't work.
I'm going to need to see more than the paper in which you got wrong whether a virus went extinct, after not actually bothering to measure its fitness. Oh, and using the wrong reference genome. Because you did that, too.
Species go extinct anyway.
Okay, so let's look at Drosophila melanogaster, which is a common laboratory model organism. It's a fruit fly. It has a mutation rate of about 3 2/3 times slower than humans, but we'll call it 4 times slower than humans. That's generous to the creationists. It has a generation time of about 10 days, as opposed to the human generation time of, on the low end, about 20 years. So, 800 times faster. That means in the time it takes for a human being to be born and then go on to reproduce at a lower than normal age, fruit flies will have gone through 800 generations. And that's on the low end. But given the lower mutation rate, which, all things being equal, should lower the estimate, and being extremely generous, D. melanogaster should be experiencing genetic entropy about 200 times faster than humans. So let's presume, again to be nice, that they and the humans both started with pristine genomes after your fake flood there, Robert. So that means that in the 4,400 years that humans have been decaying away, fruit flies should have had the equivalent of 880,000 years of genetic entropy. Now, you might know if you ever left some fruit out accidentally and went on vacation, fruit flies are doing pretty well in the modern world. But warnings about genetic entropy are often couched in terms of the imminent doom of the human species. But judging by how the fruit flies are doing, which is just fine with no observable problems of genetic entropy, it seems like humans don't have to worry at any time in the foreseeable future, because apparently genetic entropy is so slow that it just doesn't happen in any measurable way, even in rapidly reproducing groups. And you know what we do when we can't measure something at all in science? We just ignore it, because it doesn't exist, or it doesn't matter. I think you can guess which one. No, I'll just tell you, it doesn't exist.
So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, and welcome back to the next part of this series in which Robert Carter disproves evolution by getting the science wrong. Which is ironic since he actually has a biology degree. Once again, I'm addressing him directly since I know he's seen at least some of my stuff, and since he doxed someone else while trying to dox me. Plus, when he admitted I was right about something, he then couldn't be bothered to say my name. Anyway, you're on, Bobby. Oh no!
And the number of flu generations here is approximately the number of generations that evolutionists claim separate humans from chimpanzees. Oh.
You mean that after many generations, neither chimps nor humans are likely to have gone extinct? What a blow to evolution! But let's take a look at that. Both organisms have a similar generation time, but 20 years is on the low end for both. So let's just go with that, as again, that's generous to you, Dr. Carter. I'll also assume a long ago divergence of 13 million years. So that's 650,000 generations. That's how many generations fruit flies would go through in about 18,000 years. So they would experience 4 times as much genetic entropy in the scenario as they have in the scenario in which they survived the flood. Which again is 0. So 4 times 0, carry the 0, 0.0... Yep, all that math and I came up with nothing. There's no reason to think anything bad would happen.
If we really were millions of years old, we would be extinct.
Got a citation for that both supports the claim and isn't full of obvious errors? No? Well then, I get to ignore this claim.
I'm going to show you another illustration. This is one of those big idea things. I was at a conference. There was a documentary that PBS put together, and they had shown it in public school classrooms all over the country that year. And in that documentary, they outwardly mocked Christianity.
Did they mock Christianity, or did they mock your specific brand of anti-science Christianity? Somehow, I feel like the average science-accepting mainline Protestant, Catholic, or Eastern Orthodox Christian felt quite unmocked. But then, I haven't seen it.
But the Supreme Court has laid down the law. They said all instruction must be religiously neutral.
Hey, that might change now, so who knows, maybe we'll get officially civic monotheistic schools back.
So the documentary actually broke the law. And right now there's a lawsuit going through the court systems. Probably won't go anywhere, but it's going through the court systems right now because they shouldn't have done it.
Maybe it did. I don't know. I haven't seen it, and I don't really care.
But while I was watching this documentary, I realized that every single thing the evolutionist was using to support evolutionary theory, I agreed with.
Yeah, well, young Earth creationists have been so backed into a corner that basically all you're left with is, well, evolution happened, but like, not that much, man.
Did you catch that? Do you see the deceit?
Not from the documentary, but then again, I still haven't seen it, nor am I sure why it's important.
By saying something that's true, something else is true, that something else is true, something else is true, since all of it does agree with evolutionary theory, therefore evolutionary theory must be correct.
Damn it, Bobby. That's just how arguments work.
Watch. Here is the world of creation. Here is the world of evolution. This is what Charles Darwin did, and evolution since then. They get a list of facts that fits their theory. Fits my theory, fits my theory, fits my theory. All these facts must disprove your theory. That's what they say.
No, they utterly ignore you for the most part, because you don't matter. You produce no new inventions that depend on the ideas of your work. You make no useful predictions that provide avenues for new research. Instead, you just cosplay at science inside of one of a few echo chambers, and when real scientists actually even notice you, it's with bemused surprise that you even still exist. No one is defining their science in opposition to you. Some people, like me, like to debunk you because you lied to my face for decades, and a few other people who are actual scientists do it as a fun hobby. But let's be real here. You matter as much to evolutionary biologists as flat earthers matter to NASA. On the whole, they don't care about you, they don't think about you, and they find it absurd that you even exist.
But this is reality.
It is, though, because for young Earth creationism to be true, most of biology, all of particle physics, most of thermodynamics, virtually all of astronomy, all of geology, most of chemistry, and most of meteorology would have to be wrong.
Natural selection is explainable in both theories.
I feel like while there is some overlap that's appropriate in that Venn diagram, it's a pretty small amount.
And almost all the evidence that an evolutionist will use is actually explained on both sides.
No, it can be accommodated by creationism. But even today, there are creationists who reject it. See my earlier series about Randy Galuza of the Institute of Creation Research. It's a prediction of evolution. A confirmed one at that.
I call this non-discriminating information. It's information you can't use to decide between two theories.
Yeah, there's a difference between desperate post hoc ideas to accommodate data you've never predicted, and even previously said would not be found, and making confirmed predictions which then go on to be the basis of further research. Creationism is doing the former. Evolution, the latter. That's why this is not a serious scientific endeavor. Cool. Now let's get out of the realm of unlabeled Venn diagrams and into the world of actually talking about science.
You know, Charles Darwin wrote an entire book, The Origin of Species. And in that book, he never defined what a species is.
He didn't have to. He relied on species concepts that came before him. You don't have to define everything in every book. You can rely on the previous work of others. But let's go and talk about species concepts and why, since all of them run into problems, for some reason that's a problem for evolution, per se, and not just a problem for taxonomy.
But I can't define the word species.
Then you're not trying. There are numerous species concepts like the biological species concept, the ecological species concept, the phylogenetic species concept, and the morphospecies concept. Just describe a bunch of them and then note that when an organism would be a species on the basis of as many as can be applied to that group, then they can be reasonably termed a species, with the caveat that species are just a human concept and a conventional way to organize life forms to make them easier to talk about. It's really not impossible to do.
Nobody can. It's a Latin word, it means type.
That's mighty fine etymology there.
Well, okay, fine. But what's a species? You've heard of a zorse or a zonkey?
Yes, they're hybrids of either E. cabilis and E. africanus, or with any of the members of subgenus Hippotigris. They're usually sterile, but some females of specific crossings may rarely produce foals.
You ever hear of a liger?
Yes, it's a cross between a male Panthera leo and a female P. tigris, in which males are sterile, but females are not.
You know, female ligers can have cubs with tigers or lions. You know that, right?
Yup.
They're not like mules.
Well, they're a little like mules in that they can't breed true, and there have been a handful of verified reports of mule mares giving birth to viable foals.
What's a species? I have no idea.
It's a group of organisms that fits one or more of the species concepts. So let's look at them in terms of P. leo and P. tigris. First up, the biological species concept says that if organisms can mate and produce fertile offspring, they're the same species. This is basically half the case, as interfertility between the species is limited to females. So by this definition, it's iffy, but I'd say they don't meet it. Well, the ecological species concept says that organisms can be in the same species if they breed and are adapted to a particular set of specific resources, a niche, and an environment. Well, tigers are adapted primarily to solitary ambush hunting and swimming in jungles. Lions are adapted for group ambush and pursuit hunting in dry grasslands, and their prey is different, so by this definition, they are different species. Okay, on to the phylogenetic species concept. Well, that says that a species is an irreducible group of members who are descended from a common ancestor and who all possess a combination of certain defining or derived traits. I'd argue that lions and tigers separately very much meet this definition, so they're different species. Well, last but not least, let's look at the morphospecies concept. That says that a species are a group of individuals that are morphologically similar to one another and are morphologically distinct from other groups. I think just about everyone would be able to group lions together as morphologically similar to all other lions and do the same with tigers, and then note that the groups are distinct from one another, so they are separate morphospecies. Since tigers and lions are definitely different ecospecies, phylospecies, and morphospecies, but their existence as a distinct biological species is a bit iffy, I think the only reasonable conclusion is that they are distinct species, despite the existence of captive fertile hybrids. And guess what? That's the consensus of like all phyllid taxonomists too. Cool how that works.
My definition of species is if two things can interbreed, I call them the same species.
Have you ever just Googled species concepts? I mean, that would be a good start. Maybe do that, Dr. Marine Biologist. Glad you picked the one that you learned in 6th grade and then never bothered to progress further in your understanding of biology, despite somehow earning a PhD in a biological field. I wonder how you managed that.
Red wolves, gray wolves, all domestic dogs, the Australian dingo, the African jackal can all interbreed freely. That's all one species.
Cool. Do they collectively meet all the other definitions? No, they don't. Maybe that's why the golden jackal, as well as the American coyote, which you left out, that is Canis aureus and C. latrans, are considered separate species from C. lupus, the gray wolf, which contains the domesticated subspecies C. lupus familiaris.
Yet I have no problem calling the gray wolf and the red wolf different species because they look a little different, they act a little different, they live in different places. Okay, fine.
Odd, because that's the one canid you've mentioned whose status as a species or subspecies is actually contentious. Whether it's a species, a subspecies of C. lupus, or a hybrid C. lupus C. latrans population is still debated. And for that reason, it is sometimes left off of endangered species lists.
But just because we call it a species doesn't mean actually they're genetically distinct.
Well, different members of phylospecies are, but that's the thing with C. rufus, the red wolf. It's not clear that it meets the phylospecies or ecospecies definitions. We know it doesn't meet the biological species definition. So other than being morphologically distinct, it's not clear that it is a separate species.
Boy, that's a huge problem. Because all of a sudden, if we can't define what a species is, how do we talk about the evolution of species?
Because no matter how ill-defined species are, clades exist, that is, groups of individuals who share a particular most recent common ancestor. So C. lupus and C. latrans still share a common ancestor more recently than the one they share with C. aureus, which shares a common ancestor with those two more recently than it does with Q1 alpinus, the dole, which coincidentally means I can't abbreviate the genera to just C anymore. Lame. So, because we can figure out where clades are, we can trace those through time. That's what evolution is about. Biology doesn't really care what we name groups of organisms. Those aren't real parts of the organisms in question. But clades are. They represent historic realities about the past ancestry of organisms. And the question between anti-evolution creationists and science is how far back can these things be traced? Anti-evolution puts arbitrary stopping points at levels chosen to make creationists happy. Science just sees where the data lead, and it turns out that they lead to universal common ancestry.
Wow, okay, there was actually an article that appeared in our Journal of Creation, it just appeared on our website not too long ago. It's about the cat kind.
Are you referencing Cats, Big and Small by David Catchpole, published June 19th, 2017 on Creation.com, or The Family of Cats, Delineation of the Feline Basic Type by Barnabas Pendragon and Nico Winkler, from March 24th, 2017. Let's see if I can figure it out.
And then I should have had this. This would have been perfect right here. They've got this chart of all these different species of cat, from the lion and tiger all the way down to the house cat. They had pumas on there, they had lynxes on there, they had the serval and all those cool like mini cats that look kind of like Bengal tigers, but they're like a double-sized house cat. All those kind of species of cats. And they had all these lines connecting which ones are known to interbreed.
Cool, that's no help then. They both have that chart.
Now, there's not a direct link between lions and your kitty cat because, well, one of them always gets eaten, but there's an indirect route. The big cats can interbreed with the little cats, and the little cats, the medium-sized cats, and medium-sized cats can interbreed with the little cats. There is a continuum from your tiger to your tabby.
If the chart in those articles is to be trusted, yes.
There really is only one cat species.
That is not the conclusion to draw here. Have I spent this whole time talking about species concepts other than the biological species concept for no reason? Those animals don't fit any of the species concept besides the biological one, and even then, except within a genus, it's iffy.
The Bible describes created kinds, that God created different things to reproduce after their kinds. Well, the Bible uses reproduction as a criterion for what's in a kind and what's not.
Does it though? Because it says that organisms will bring forth after their kind, but that doesn't mean that what they bring forth has to remain interfertile. In fact, we have cases where CMI thinks that we have a kind, but we have no evidence of hybrids. Where are the hybrids between Canis, Lycaon, and Vulpes among the canid kind? Oh, there aren't any? So fun that if animals can breed, they're in the same kind, but if they can't, then maybe they're still in the same kind. Makes the definition useless. By that definition, humans are certainly in a kind with each other, but they could just as well be in a kind with elephants, pine trees, and mushrooms.
So do biologists. If two things can interbreed, they're the same species, they're the same kind.
Except, that's wrong on both fronts. Species are not defined solely by the biological species concept, and biology has no time for the word kind, because a useful definition has never been developed to determine when things are in different kinds, or where the boundaries of kinds are, nor are there any useful, testable predictions that have been made and confirmed on the basis of the idea of created kinds. Sure, there have been retrodictions, but since they all boil down to basically, some organisms can breed with each other, that's not exactly revolutionary, since it's been known since before civilization that yes, some organisms can breed with each other.
Dogs and cats cannot interbreed, but all dogs can interbreed and all cats can interbreed.
Not if by dog you mean canine, because there have been no confirmed fox hybrids with members of genus Canis, nor any crosses with either and the dole, nor any of those and the African painted dog. Sorry, but unless you've got a new animal to show that's a cross between previously not known to hybridize canines, you're just wrong about this. And I must ask again, Dr. Carter, did you know you were wrong, or are you just incompetent about this too? Now, I know you could perhaps fall back on saying that by dog you only mean members of genus Canis. Let's not forget that in your journal, Gene K. Leitner in 2010 said that all extant canines are descended from 2 individuals on Noah's Ark, and in 2019 on Creation.com, your website, Cody J. Guittard said that there was a canid kind, so apparently it's not just canines, because the group also includes the extinct borophagine or bone-crushing dogs that are all in the same kind. I look forward to your new evidence of family-wide hybridization in Canada.
We'll start off with a statement, a fun statement. The field of genetics has been at war with Darwinism since genetics was invented.
Weird, because the whole field of phylogenetics is basically just the marriage of evolutionary biology and genetics. Kind of hard to be at war while working happily at the same project without a hint of conflict. And also, there's a field of paleogenomics, which not only uses sequences from ancient fossils that are still young enough for sequences to be made, but also uses forensic techniques to recover the likely state of the genomes of evolutionary ancestors of modern groups. Is this sort of like how peanut butter and jelly are at war, or how Batman and Robin are at war? Seems like it.
Gregor Mendel came up with the laws of genetics just a few years after Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. I just read an essay a couple months ago. This person realized that when you read Mendel's works, point for point for point, he's paralleling The Origin of Species.
That would be odd, since there's no reason to think either man read the other's work, in part because of a language barrier, and in part because, tragically, no one in the late 1800s seemed to care about the work of Gregor Mendel.
And discrediting The Origin of Species.
Who cares? The book is more than 16 decades old. How does modern genetics discredit modern evolutionary biology? Despite, being part of it.
Charles Darwin needed, remember that small variation Darwin talked about? He needed everything from really tall to really small and everything in between. Mendel said, no, genes say tall or short.
No, he didn't say that traits had to be discrete. You could have a tall, not so tall, a short, and a not so short group of alleles, according to him, and even more gradations. That genetics involves discrete units doesn't tell you anything about how different the outcomes or traits are going to be. Plus, some traits, like sickle cell, are codominant, and rather than being one or the other, can combine. Which, is the thing you made a big deal about earlier.
Not everything in between. And they didn't know what to do with him.
Who are they? The people who ignored him because no one thought the work of some monk playing with plants was very significant? Or the people who later rediscovered his work and then created the field of genetics, which was easily integrated into the Neo-Darwinian synthesis in the 1940s? Well, I doubt I'm going to get an answer.
50 years later, they came up with this idea called Neo-Darwinism. They invented mutations. Mutations, that answers.
They invented mutations? Are you saying mutations are fake? Because mutations are seen to happen in real time, in the real world. Even if the concept was invented, it describes a real measurable phenomenon.
This whole thing, why does this fruit fly have red eyes and this one have white eyes? A mutation happened. All that Mendel stuff was just mutations.
What? No, he wasn't dealing primarily with mutations, but with pre-existing alleles. And the mutations still follow the basic laws of Mendelian genetics after they occur. Mutations didn't replace Mendel, they supplemented his work.
That worked until the 1950s.
What happened in the 50s? Did people decide that mutations didn't happen all along?
When mathematicians started analyzing evolutionary theory with math, they realized, you know what?
We're not trained in this field, but even if we were, we'd label our y-axis unlike John Sanford in the on-screen graph.
Even with millions of years, we can't explain the difference between man and monkeys.
Ooh, are we going to be getting into the waiting time problem? That'll be fun. But I won't jump the gun on you there, Bobby.
That's not enough time. And they dealt with that for a while. They invented junk DNA in the 70s, and that lasted until we sequenced the human genome. That's dead.
And then found that, yes, there is junk DNA. And it's the majority of the DNA. And by junk, I basically mean non-sequence constrained DNA, not useless DNA. Many of you have a junk drawer at home, not because the stuff in there is useless, but because it's useful to keep around, even if much of it has little specific purpose and doesn't matter all that much most days.
But this is what's happened recently. Back in the day, way back in the day, Darwinism reigned supreme.
And people label the axes on their graphs.
Darwinists could explain, or at least claim to explain, all the science that we knew.
Bullshit. Never mind the fact that biologists don't try to explain science outside of biology, and ignore the fact that no one has been a Darwinist for nearly a century. But there has never been a time when there have not been open fields of research in biology since the origin of the field. If there's an open question in a field, it means it's a question that currently can't be answered.
But it's gotten away from them. The modern technological revolution has unveiled so many things inside life that Darwinism cannot explain, that their power of explanation has collapsed.
Ooh, what are these many things? Are you sure there are many things and not, nothing? Not that modern evolutionary biology has it all figured out, but the heavy implication is that there are things that preclude it, not just that are currently open questions.
I said this earlier, I'll say it again. If life were really simple, Darwinism might explain it.
No, that would be a problem, because since evolution proceeds only by modifying what came before, and often has to suffice with jury-rigging previous forms, it would predict that life in some cases is needlessly complex, like the mammal blood clotting cascade, or plant photosynthesis. Of course, that doesn't mean all life has to get more and more complex, but it would predict that some would, to the point of absurdity. Does the amoeba need a genome 100 times larger than a human? Probably not, but that's the kind of thing evolution would predict should happen in some organisms. Further, we've not been given any reason why complexity per se is a problem for evolution. If a complex trait is advantageous, why can't it be selected for? What would prevent a trait from increasing in complexity on occasion for mutation? Seems to me like there's no reason for either.
See, in Darwin's day, life, was based on a cell, but a cell was just a bag of salts. They called it protoplasm. They didn't know what was inside the cell.
They knew it was more than salt. And why are we talking about what Darwin knew? Darwin was ignorant of much, and wrong about much. Who cares? He's still not Pope of Science, nor was he ever. You know how much of evolutionary biology you can learn without ever once reading any of Darwin's works? All of it. It's all of it.
And if it was square or round, whatever, grew a spike or turned purple, I could imagine all sorts of changes in a really simple system. The problem is, the more we understand about complexity, the power of Darwinism to explain it goes the opposite direction.
Why? Don't just assert it, explain what the problem is. Otherwise, this is just the same as me saying the longer the sun keeps spinning on its axis, the less true Christianity becomes. Sure, I can say it, but it's stupid unless I can connect a reason the sun should stop to the truth value of Christianity.
And life as we know it today is not at all simple.
True, so because everyone agrees, I'm going to skip all your examples of it being complicated. I'm not here to sit around a fire and sing kumbaya about life being cool or complex. When you get to a point worth discussing, we'll pick this back up.
Any single particular letter in the genome is used, on average, in 6 different messages.
Yeah, I'm going to press X to doubt that each codon in the genome affects on average 6 different traits. But let's pretend you said a non-stupid thing and that you meant gene because yes, most genes actually do affect more than one trait.
So that letter might affect your ability to digest garlic, how well you see in the dark, how tall you are, and what your skin color is. Not true, but it could affect 6 random things that have nothing to do with one another. Change that one letter, what happens now? Which trait is natural selection going to try to act on?
It doesn't have to act on one in particular, it acts at the whole organism level. So if the combination of those traits is beneficial, it will favor the mutation. If it's detrimental, it will act against the spread of that mutation. And if it's neutral, it won't act at all, and the mutation will be solely subject to drift. So in this example, if one of those traits, say night vision, is very useful, but the effects to garlic digestion, skin color, and height are minor in terms of reproductive success, then the mutation is beneficial. There's a thing called addition and subtraction, where you can just sum up the effects of change to multiple things at a time. Now granted, that's a conceptual thing. It's basically impossible to actually measure the effect of each individual change in most cases, but it's still the idea. The sum effect of all those fitness changes is what's going to be acted on by natural selection. This really isn't a high-level concept.
It can't. The system grinds to a halt if one change affects multiple different things that have nothing to do with one another.
Why? If there's a selected for trait, such as better night vision, that also happens to mean that a minor food source like garlic is now useless, but that's outweighed by the benefit of better night vision, then you get a population that abandons garlic and gets better night vision. That's just a trade-off. Evolution is already all about trade-offs. A bacterium will trade off the efficiency of a transmembrane transport protein to resist an antibiotic. A fish will trade off a higher infection rate for the ability to see. Humans might trade off the overall production of most digestive enzymes in order to produce lactase late in life to gain access to a new calorie-dense food. That trade-offs occur and that they can be complicated in no way means that natural selection grinds to a halt.
And life is so complicated that we absolutely know that that is true.
Life is so complicated that we absolutely know that it's true that natural selection grinds to a halt for no reason. Okay, buddy, that makes total sense and doesn't at all make you look like a raving madman who might be eating flies to collect their life essence for his master, who's on his way to England on a ghost ship. I'm going to recommend against your request for a kitten. And if you're in my audience and you got that, then maybe we can be friends.
You started out as a little cell in your mama, and then you split, and then you split, and then you split. Well, the little machines are copying the DNA. There's 3 billion letters in your DNA. Every time they make a copy, they make mistakes.
Yep, mutations.
You have 100 trillion cells in your adult bodies. You're right now carrying every single possible mutation. Essentially, every day, your body develops every single cancer.
Not really, but I get where you're going, and it's fine as an approximation.
Most of them are fixed, which is why you're still alive, but every once in a while, one escapes the fixing systems. It is estimated that a 50-year-old person has 60,000 mutations in every skin cell that they weren't born with.
Estimated by whom? When? Where?
Yeah, I'm going to be 49 this year. I'm looking at 60,000 mutations, and I've got millions upon millions of skin cells. Every one of them has different mutations. You are going to die of mutation accumulation if you don't get hit by a bus.
Or die of heart disease, liver disease, an infection, or some other calamity. But yeah, if you live long enough without any fatal injuries or other fatal diseases, cancer is sort of an inevitability.
We can't stop it. There's nothing you can do to stop. Well, you can slow it down maybe, antioxidants or don't smoke and things like that. Those things help. But in general, it's going to catch up with everyone in this room, and we're going to die eventually because your body is actually falling apart. That's genetic entropy.
Seriously, you were doing so well. Genetic entropy is a population phenomenon, not a phenomenon of individuals. If you want to make the analogy that a human is a population of human cells, then far from genetic entropy, cancer is runaway increase in fitness. It's evolution in action. And sure, eventually the whole population will collapse, but that was always going to happen anyway. While it exists, the cancer is by far the most evolutionarily successful group of cells in there, and they even evolve inside individual patients to be better able to avoid treatment and the immune system.
But it's not just falling apart on the individual level, it's also falling apart on the species level.
Not as far as anyone has ever been able to observe.
Because when we have children, we pass a small amount of mutations to our children. Every child born on average has about 100 mutations their parents weren't born with.
Sure, sounds about right. I don't know the actual pedigree mutation rate off the top of my head, but I won't contest this one.
Now, most mutations don't do anything.
Hey, what is this, like the third or fourth thing you've said that's actually flat out correct? Nice job.
They don't affect reproduction. They don't affect intelligence. There's 1 out of 3 billion letters. Change one letter. What's the chance that that letter is going to kill you? Very small.
Yeah, it's also a very small chance that it will do literally anything else. Most mutations occur in non-sequence constrained regions because that's a big majority of the genome. And of those that don't, a significant fraction are synonymous mutations anyway, which means it again causes no changes.
But it's like rust on a car again.
Is it though? Because that verifiably does something. That, in a calculable, measurable way, lowers the structural strength of parts. How does a mutation in a non-sequence constrained region do that? Oh, right. It doesn't. It literally, unlike rust, causes no change.
Our species, our genomes are rusting out over time. Natural selection is not improving us, it's just preventing us from going extinct quicker. That means actually it doesn't help Darwinism at all.
If only genetic entropy were real and not, mathematically impossible. I don't say this very often, right? In science, generally speaking, you can't prove anything. But genetic entropy is a fundamentally mathematical concept. It is trivially easy to prove without any doubt at all that genetic entropy isn't real. It's as fake as a four-sided triangle.
You ever heard, creationism is not testable. You ever heard that?
Yeah, parts of it are, parts of it aren't. It's too broad to simply say it's not testable, although I get why people say it. The important parts, like that maybe miracles happened, aren't really testable. But still, I try not to say it myself. I like a bit more nuance in my statements.
Evolution is testable. You're crazy. You're just making stuff up.
I'm not sure how seriously to take that, but evolution is testable, and creationists do just make stuff up. But so does everyone. The important bit is, does the stuff you make up lead to testable predictions, and if so, when we test them, are they confirmed? If yes to both, then hooray! The stuff you made up is supported by evidence. If not, then boo, time to try again.
Well, that's not true. The Bible directly predicts one male and one female ancestor of all people.
Specifically that the human effective and census size was literally 2 at some point in the recent past.
Guess what's true in genetics?
That coalescence analysis can be run on the autosomal portion of the human genome, and it shows that they never had a population size as small as 2.
There's only one male and one female ancestor of all people on Earth.
Literally not the conclusion of any scientific study. If I'm wrong, Bobby, then just produce the paper that concludes that.
The evolutionists called her mitochondrial Eve and him Y chromosome Adam. They should have called him Y chromosome Noah, but okay, so they don't understand the Bible as well. They actually gave them biblical names anyway.
Who again is one common ancestor of all humans, not the first male ever, as even you know, but also not even the most recent common ancestor for all humans. He's just the most recent male human who can trace his lineage through all extant male humans via an all-male line.
The Bible predicts, because we only come from 2 people, you can't put a lot of genetic diversity into 2 people.
Fair enough, at most 4 allele per genome in the autosomal DNA, 3 per gene on the X chromosome, and 1 per gene on the Y chromosome, not the Y has a lot of genes.
I can explain all the people in this room. You give me 6,000 years of mutation, and God front-loading Adam and Eve with some genetic diversity that's not mutation, and we can put all the people here into Adam and Eve.
No, we really can't.
We don't need millions of years. We don't need common ancestry with chimpanzees.
I'm glad you came up with a post hoc rationalization to dismiss the genetic evidence that clearly indicates that the human species is hundreds of thousands of years old, and that they are certainly related to chimpanzees. But guess what? Post hoc accommodations are basically meaningless. Evolution predicted the genetic evidence and got it right. Further, you can only get 2 humans 6,000 years ago by ignoring the autosomal portions of the genome, and then pretending that the pedigree mutation rates are the same as the phylogenetic replacement rates, which they're not. To get a pedigree mutation rate, you just check some DNA from a parent and their child, count the differences, and boom, mutation rate. But here's the problem. Some of the mutations in the parent and the child won't be in either's germline, so those are obviously not going to be carried forward to future generations. Then only some of the mutations actually in the germline are going to end up in a new human, since most humans don't have enough kids that all of their mutations are going to end up in the next generation. Maybe if you're Genghis Khan who had like 1,000 kids, that's reasonable, but most of us aren't Genghis Khan. Further, even after mutations make it into a new child, there is selection and drift that weed out further mutations. All of this lowers the rate at which mutations accumulate in a population. And the thing is, this isn't something we have to guess at. There are locations like the Canary Islands and Tristan da Cunha that were settled not at some remote point in the past, but for the first time by humans in historical times, when people could simply write about the settlement, and the archaeological evidence corroborates these timeframes. Archaeology that young Earth creationists generally accept and that fits well within their timeframe. When we check these populations, we find that yes, their phylogenetic replacement rate is indeed slower than the pedigree mutation rate. And when we use that measurement to look for Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve, we get individuals who themselves almost certainly were not contemporaries, and who both also lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, not only a few thousand years ago.
The Bible also predicts one dispersal of humanity across the world. That's called the Tower of Babel in the Bible. The evolution is called out of Africa.
Those aren't synonyms. Those are competing hypotheses. In Out of Africa, Homo sapiens begins in Africa, probably around modern Ethiopia, and then spreads both into the rest of Africa and out into the rest of the world via the Sinai Peninsula. In the Tower of Babel idea, humans start in the Fertile Crescent and spread from there. These ideas make opposing predictions.
Why do they start in Africa? Multiple reasons.
Humans are more closely related genetically and morphologically to the African great apes than the orangutan, which is why the idea was first proposed. When the first non-human hominids, aside from Neanderthal, were found, it was primarily in Africa, with only later members of genus Homo spreading outside, including the aforementioned Neanderthals. The oldest H. sapiens fossils are in Africa, and the icing on the cake is that genetic diversity is highest in East Africa, linkage disequilibrium is lowest there, and all non-African genetic diversity is a subset of one portion of African genetic diversity. It's pretty conclusive. Why, Dr. Carter? What do you think the reasons are?
I think there's some latent racism here, because Darwin and his disciples always believed the Africans were closer to monkeys.
Well, no matter what they thought, Africans, along with the rest of humanity, are so close to monkeys that they just are monkeys. You don't get to escape your ancestry. All humans, regardless of where they're from, regardless of what they look like, regardless of any past or present oppression, are all equally monkeys. But regardless of that particular belief, which I neither care to verify nor refute that Darwin and his friends held, the reasoning and evidence remains conclusive. Humans came from Africa.
And therefore, of course, we evolved in Africa.
No, that wouldn't be sufficient. That would allow for humans evolving in Africa, Asia, and South America at least. And for a while, the multi-regional hypothesis was actually popular and was far more racist. It was the idea that humans independently evolved from monkeys and apes in several places around the world, and so a Chinese human, an African human, and a South American human might actually be separate but related species, essentially.
Today, there's a lot more diversity in Africa than other places in the world. And there's two ways to do that. Either you have an older population, or your population went through more generations.
Well, there's no particular evidence to think that Africans in prehistory had significantly shorter generation times than other humans, but it still doesn't help with the fact that non-Africans are a subset of Africans. They nest within the African groups. Everyone outside of Africa is more closely related to some Africans than those Africans are to other Africans. You have to explain that, and just pointing out a rescue device for the higher diversity in Africa isn't going to help with that.
There's lots of different ways to get differences between populations, and they're basing the entire thing on the fact that some Africans have more mutations than the rest of the world put together.
And that the earliest fossils of humans were found in Africa, and that the rest of the world isn't just lower in diversity, that it's nested within the African diversity. That's a problem you can't just hand wave away by saying, I don't know, Africans just have babies young and they mutate a lot.
But how do I know that's older? What if they're just like more mutated than everyone else alive today?
Then they wouldn't be recovered in every rooted phylogenetic analysis as encompassing all other diversity. They'd be a sister group to either all non-African diversity or a subset of non-African diversity.
If that's the case, then the origin of people isn't the place where everyone's spread out from.
The origin of people isn't the place that everyone set out from. I don't even know what you're trying to get across there.
Think about it. The out of Africa theory says that small people groups traveling into uninhabited territory migrated with one Y chromosome and one mitochondrial ancestor in the recent past, even for an evolutionist, through the Middle East.
Basically, yeah, there was one exit to the Middle East that eventually gave rise to the rest of non-African humanity.
All of those are things you would directly predict from the Tower of Babel account in Genesis.
No, you'd predict that humans would expand from the Middle East and that some subset of them would go into Africa, while others went into Europe and Asia, and from Asia into Australia, Oceania, and the Americas. Which would mean that African humans should be a sister group to non-Africans or nested within some group of otherwise non-Africans. That's not what we see.
But they don't want you to think that way.
You're right, I don't want people to think in a way that's directly counter to the evidence.
I explained that, by the way, in this talk, Mitochondrial Eve and the Three Daughters of Noah.
Might be something for me to look into.
All right, I'm going to hit this subject very briefly. The origin of life. You see, if evolution can't explain the origin of life, then evolutionists need to go home.
You see, if sculptors can't explain the origin of granite, they need to go home. The fact that a particular explanatory mechanism has a starting point that isn't basically just the beginning of all things doesn't invalidate it. Evolution remains true whether or not science can explain the origin of life. In fact, even if life were miraculously created, that doesn't falsify evolution. Evolutionary biology isn't here to disprove God or form an explanation for all phenomena. It's about the diversity and change in reproducing biological populations over time. If you don't have any such populations, then you don't have biological evolution.
Darwin tried to avoid it. He joked. He said, you might as well talk about the origin of matter. Yeah, it's called Big Bang, Darwin. They talk about it now.
Yeah, because now cosmology has testable predictions about such things.
Because people realize if we can't explain the origin of matter, what are we going to have? God explain it?
Maybe. It probably wouldn't upset the theist who also doesn't reject evolution. And while it wouldn't be a scientific explanation, it might still be the right one. But we probably shouldn't stop looking into scientific ideas just because, like in all things, someone has said, yeah, but what if it was a god?
You can't invoke God. That's not naturalism. What if science was just a way of thinking that might help to explain things? So one way of thinking is Zeus is standing on top of a mountaintop, and he's got his lightning bolt ready, and when I get out my petri dish and I do an experiment, he's going to either zap my lightning bolt or not zap my lightning bolt. That is a way of thinking. It's not really very conducive to science, is it?
hence why it's not a conclusion that science can reach. But scientists sure can.
You've seen this before, I'm sure. Come on now, there you go. Boom, you've seen this, right? The famous Miller-Urey experiment. They've got gases bubbling up, and they're zapping them with electricity, and they're dripping down here. Do you know what they're making down here? You know what that is? It's just random molecules.
Among which are specifically amino acids, which until then had not been shown to form spontaneously in abiotic conditions. It was thereby proof of the concept that amino acids could predate life. That's all the experiment meant to do. The question was, can this class of very important chemicals that life needs form without life? The answer was yes. Since then, scientists have gone on to do better experiments in conditions more closely approximating that of prebiotic Earth and have had even more success. But I'm betting you aren't going to talk about any of that there, Dr. Carter.
Because random chemical reactions produce random molecules. You are not made of random molecules. You're made of a very specific set of molecules.
Some of which were made in that experiment. And it's not like abiogenesis, that is the beginning of life from non-living chemicals, involved the spontaneous formation of humans or any other modern living thing.
There's this many potential molecules that are made in that reaction, and you're made out of this many.
I fail to see the relevance. No one has ever thought that the Miller-Urey experiment demonstrated how life came about. It wasn't meant to. It was meant, like most experiments, to help answer one specific question. Again, that question was, can amino acids form in abiotic conditions? Again, the answer was yes.
That is not supposed to be true, but it is.
In science, nothing is supposed to be true. That's the kind of thinking that leads to a conclusion first, evidence later thinking. The kind of thing creationists like to do.
Worse, there are molecules that you absolutely depend upon for life that can never be made in this reaction.
Yep, that's true, and it's still irrelevant to anything.
They're too fragile. As soon as they touch one of these tar molecules, they're destroyed instantly.
Since the tar is where the samples were collected in the experiment, then, if that were true, wouldn't the experiment have failed to show that it created amino acids? Are you now accusing Miller and Urey of fraud, Dr. Carter? Because it's either that, or you're lying, or you're massively incompetent. Again, I ask you to let me know for future reference.
The origin of life, they cannot explain most complex organic molecules. Yeah, you can make some, fine.
Amino acids, RNA, lipid bilayer membranes, and even amino acid polymers can all be formed in labs in prebiotically relevant conditions.
But not DNA.
DNA almost certainly was not present in the first life, so there's no particular reason to think it needs to be explained as some abiotic process. We know RNA chains can form abiotically, and that's all that's needed for the genomes of the first organisms. In fact, RNA chains can auto-catalyze their own formation, and evolve without being in a cell. Further, they can catalyze the formation of proteins all on their own with no ribosome needed. The fact we can't spontaneously create a modern cell doesn't mean anything for the possibility of life to form without a miracle on a prebiotic Earth.
Not proteins.
Right, but proteins can be formed by RNA, which itself can form spontaneously.
They can't make polymers.
RNA is a polymer. It forms spontaneously.
This is funny. You are polymers. You have long chains of DNA, long chain proteins, and long chain sugars. Long chain fats. That is you. This is what you're built of. Long molecules. All life, from the simplest bacterium to astronauts, require long molecules. The problem is, the polymerization reaction that makes those molecules, a chemist would never do it in the presence of water.
Weird, because that's where it happens in life. In water.
Because water always breaks the bonds apart, and it breaks it down so fast that chemists get rid of all the water because it'll destroy their proteins, their fats, anything they're trying to polymerize.
You may or may not be aware of this, but all life lives in and around water. Water is the solvent of organic chemistry. And while it's true that water will hydrolyze various organic polymers, it does so at a particular measurable rate, and if the rate of synthesis is higher, then the system will contain a persistent level of these organic polymers. That's all it takes. If the system is making polymers just a bit faster than the water degrades them, then they get to stick around on net.
So life had to start with no water?
Nope, that's just a straw man.
Worse, the last one there. How do you get instructions out of random molecules?
Any genetic sequence of any given length will have a non-zero proportion of amino acid sequences it codes for that have some further biological activity or function, assuming it's long enough in the first place. Based on experiment, that fraction seems like it could be as high as 10% for sequences of about 100 base pairs, and if we allow for a single mutation, even higher, perhaps as high as 60%. So basically all that has to happen is the process samples a portion of sequence space about half as big as the functional portion of that space, and we get a 50-50 chance of making a functional instruction, if you will. Of course, more experiments are needed, but the fact is random sequences can and do have function.
See, DNA is not just a molecule. It's not just a code. It's a set of information. Essentially, you have an encyclopedia inside every one of your cells that tells, you start with a single cell, and the instruction set in that cell said, make you.
Cool, but what with synonymous codons and the predominance of non-sequence constrained regions, there are lots of possibilities for a genome that would make a phenotype exactly identical to your own.
Without that instruction set, you can't have life. But that instruction set would never arise from random mistakes. Random mistakes produces genetic entropy. It destroys life.
Well, since as we've already covered, random sequences can and do have function, and genetic entropy simply isn't a thing, there's not much more I need to say.
You couldn't start with a bunch of disorganized letters and randomly say, okay, let's just say you got a Scrabble set, right? And you pull out enough letters to spell out a chocolate chip cookie recipe. Is that ever going to happen?
No, human language is a poor analogy for DNA. It's a great analogy for evolution, though.
No, and if it did, someone accuse you of cheating.
And reasonably so. For English, the fraction of functional alphabetic sequences of any given length is far smaller than what it seems to be for DNA, which is why it's a poor analogy.
There is nothing in the origin of life in chemistry that suggests it's possible.
I don't know. The more than 5 million results on Google Scholar for, quote, origin of life, unquote, might disagree. As with the fact the field of abiogenesis is still putting out new research and making progress. Just in 2022, at about the end of the third quarter, there were almost 63,000 papers related to it that had been published. For example, in February, Tanya Bose et al. Reported methods for protein synthesis without a ribosome. Is it all figured out? No, and it probably never will be, but to pretend that the Miller-Urey experiment is the height of origin of life research and then just pretend that there are no mechanisms for the formation of molecules like RNA or proteins is just wrong.
In physics, that suggests it's possible. In probability, no way. Information theory?
Gotta love it when a creationist talks about information. Just like with kinds, it never gets to a useful definition that we could use to make predictions that could be tested to see if the creationists are right.
These are massive branches of science. All of them argue against the origin of life from natural processes.
Funny how the experts in those fields disagree, but I'm sure a marine biologist is going to set all the physicists straight. Including
this little guy. You know what that is? That's the world's smallest rotary engine. And just like our motors, it's powered by electricity. But instead of electrons, this guy is powered by protons. Hydrogen nuclei, H+.
It's the bacterial flagellum, isn't it?
Those protons make this thing spin. There's a rotor, there's a stator. Oh, and it takes this thing called ADP, that's phosphates. That doesn't exist in nature. Phosphate's too reactive.
Oh man, if only Yukio Yagamata hadn't reported abiotic synthesis of ATP and ADP back in 1999 in the paper Prebiotic Formation of ADP and ATP from AMP, calcium phosphates and cyanate in aqueous solutions. Now, is his reported mechanism the answer we need for the formation of these chemicals? No, but it's at least proof of concept that these can form in nature. Plus, why is this relevant? No one is suggesting that the bacterial flagellum was around in the first life. It came about much later than that, probably hundreds of millions of years after ATP started being made by cells.
And it bonds it to this thing there called, this molecule so reactive, you never find it in a free state in nature.
Probably why no one is suggesting that this particular protein complex was original to life.
This little thing here spins in circles and makes those purple things flying off. You make your own weight of this molecule called ATP every day.
Okay.
But you never find ATP in nature.
That's not what the literature says.
Why did life decide to use ATP? And how did it find it before it started?
Dunno, and it found it possibly in the wild, or it used something else like breaking hydrogen sulfide bonds, and only later evolved to use ATP.
Now I'm going to give you another really interesting thing that happens inside your cells right now. There's your piece of DNA again. DNA is a very long, fragile molecule. Now we're going to see something zip by here. This is a polymerase. Woo, there it goes. We're doing a little magic here. We're not showing all the complex things of getting things inside it. They're just floating in there magically. This polymerase is going by. It's unzipping the DNA. It's adding nucleotides to it. It's making a copy of the DNA. It's making a copy of a gene. Now, your genes are much more complicated than this. Your genes are spliced and diced before they're ready to be used. We're just really oversimplifying it just to show you what's happening. Now, when it gets to the end of the message, it says, stop. Message kicks out. But what's that thing good for?
For being copied into another strand of RNA, which then goes to a ribosome to be translated into a protein.
That RNA molecule has to be translated into protein. And we use these amazing little things. These are called transfer RNAs. At the bottom end of each transfer RNA, there's this 3-letter code that matches 3 letters in the DNA. And they go into this machine. It's called a ribosome.
At the center of which is a ribozyme, which just happens to be RNA, which again can in fact synthesize protein on its own. Ribosomes are far better at it, but they're also the product of evolution. The first life wouldn't have been as efficient as modern ribosomes.
And inside the ribosome, which also has error checking mechanisms in it, it takes these messenger RNAs, lines them up, literally pops an amino acid onto the growing protein strand that's happening inside every one of your cells millions of times every second, right now. But most proteins, if left to themselves, they'll fold into a blob and be not useful. And so these other molecules, they're called chaperones. They come and they grab onto the protein strand to prevent it from folding in properly. And they bring it to another molecule. We don't quite know how this thing works, but we know what it's shaped like and we know what it does. It's called a chaperonin, that little watermelon-shaped thing there. They stick this unfolded protein into the chaperonin. It then does this little magic and spits out a 3-dimensional folded protein.
Which is indeed very cool, but I'm not sure how that, a part of modern life, is relevant to abiogenesis. The 3 kinds of chaperonin in life are themselves evolved structures. You can't point to any one of them and then extrapolate that back to the first life. And would that mean that the first life had relatively unreliable protein synthesis? Yes. And would selection pressure favor more reliable protein synthesis? Almost certainly. And would the first life have to immediately compete with highly efficient protein synthesis? No.
We started with the 1-dimensional letters A, T, G, and C and translated it into a 3-dimensional with 20 different letters of all the different amino acids in a protein. By the way, this depends upon ATP.
It does now, but bare ribosomes don't need that. But you probably don't know about that since apparently you think that all research into this topic stopped 70 years ago.
That might be part of the ATP synthase engine. This is a chicken and egg problem now.
It was a chicken and egg problem, but like the literal chicken and egg problem, it's been solved. Eggs came first and ribozymes came before ATP.
Because all life uses ATP, all life needs the ATP synthase. But you need ATP synthase to make ATP. You need ATP to translate the proteins that are part of the ATP synthase. Actually, it's a 3-way chicken and egg problem.
Okay, Bobby, I want you to every day for the next year look into a mirror and say to yourself 10 times, the first life was not identical to any modern life.
If you don't have any of those, you're dead. How did life start?
Much simpler and less efficient.
And why on earth would it be so complicated?
A combination of selection for more reliable or efficient mechanisms, coupled with the fact that evolution can't start over. It can only jury-rig what it has already.
And why? Literally, it's translating from Swahili to Sanskrit to Old Norse to computer programming language.
I see you've forgotten what literally means, because I can guarantee you that DNA isn't in Swahili and RNA isn't in Old Norse, nor is it in computer code. As we all know, it's actually in Arabic, al-Arabiyya.
Why would it do that?
Because rather than being designed by some super smart dude, it's the result of happenstance, chance, and selection by a mindless process rather than a mind.
Unless it was not evolved by itself.
Yeah, because all designers remember to make sure that their instructions have to be translated like 4 times before the end product can be made. That's just how you do it. And hey, that's your analogy. I think it's a bad one, but it's not really working here for you.
All right, I'm running a little long. I'm going to try to hurry up here. My last section, science and morality. Before I go there, I want to show you one more big idea. Think of the smallest thing that you can see.
That's an object about 1/10 of a millimeter in size, so larger grains of dust. Got it.
Think of the shortest time that you can notice, a blink.
That's harder to figure out since the brain actually tends to filter out blinks. Humans have a variable flicker fusion rate, but by around 50 Hz, humans generally can't tell the difference between flicker and smooth motion or solid light. So the smallest amount of time a human can notice is probably on the order of 10 milliseconds or so. Interestingly, blinks happen on the scale of tenths of a second, so far longer than the smallest time a human can notice.
There's a limit to what you can directly observe. Think of the largest thing you can see in the longest time you can experience your lifetime.
The largest thing you can see is probably the Andromeda Galaxy, which is just barely visible with the naked eye on a very dark night.
There is a zone of science that we can absolutely know, see, feel, touch, taste, whatever, right here. Now we can build things like microscopes and telescopes, and we can expand our zone of direct observation.
Thanks for the 4th grade science lesson.
But evolution is not here.
Tell it to all the evolution experiments going on in labs right now that use tools and direct observation to watch evolution happen in real time.
Evolution is out here.
Some of it is, but also that time axis isn't nearly long enough. The effects of deep past events can be directly measured, and predictions about new data regarding them can be made. Evolutionary history is based in part on those direct measurements, and predictions are made about future data from the deep past, and like we've already gone over, it is frequently confirmed. Creationism doesn't do this. Where it can make non-trivial predictions that are falsifiable, they are all either already falsified or so far untested, and curiously, the creationists seem slow to bother to test their ideas. I wonder why.
Evolution is in the zone of deductions only. You can't directly test it.
Sure you can, the same way you directly test for paternity.
You can't directly see it. It is a historical science that knows nothing of the laboratory.
Wait, so the Lenski lab that is running the Lenski long-term evolution experiment, that's not a laboratory? What does the lab part mean then?
Ouch. Bill Provine, he was a colleague of Dr. John Sanford's at Cornell, committed evolutionist. He said, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods."
I don't care about this guy's metaphysics, so I'm going to skip them. This is no more relevant than me cherry-picking a Christian who thinks that science leads them to God and who does believe in God in the afterlife.
You realize that if you believe in God, the evolutionist believes that you're carrying a mutation that you inherited from your monkey and fish ancestors that causes you to believe in God?
No, it's more that your genetics certainly enables you to have a brain complex enough for such concepts, and there may be a genetic component to a propensity to believe certain things, but I don't think anyone falls so heavily on the side of nature that rather than nurture as to say that your belief in God is determined directly by your genetics. How would that account for people who change their belief in God, either gaining or losing it, or both during their lifetimes? Or how would it account for people who grew up in non-religious households who become religious, or vice versa?
You realize that the hardcore evolutionists think you're just a machine? Every thought and reaction of your mind is just chemicals. And the reason those chemicals exist and do those things is because they helped you have babies 100,000 years ago.
Hey look, an argument from consequences. It's fallacious. No matter what unpalatable results evolution might lead to, they don't make it wrong. Giving reasons you don't want evolution to be true won't change that it is. So until you stop and make arguments against evolution per se, I'm skipping.
But I wanted to impress upon you how profound the subject is.
There, I can agree. The question of where humans came from is one of profound importance for their understanding of themselves as biological beings.
How empty Darwinism is, both in the science and in the philosophy.
You probably should have done better than basically getting all the science wrong then.
And how salient in today's world the Bible still is.
Not to science it's not, because science doesn't get to start with a conclusion. If your interpretation of the Bible were right about this, then we wouldn't need to presuppose it to get to the conclusion that it's right. The evidence would simply fall in line with that. It doesn't.
It's not an empty book.
Well, yeah, it's full of all sorts of stuff.
It's not a book without power. It's not a book without explanation. Actually, it does a great job. Now, it's not a science book. It's a history book.
Not all of it is even that, and the parts that are were written before history as we know it was even conceived of. So the so-called historical narratives in the Bible were written for polemical reasons, not as sober objective recountings of events.
But as a history book, it shouldn't be wrong about the science when it talks about science.
Well then, that bit about animals looking at stripy sticks while mating and then having stripy babies might be something you want to address.
And when we look at all these different things, all these vast fields of science actually fit into biblical history, that is amazing. I didn't know that when I was growing up.
It sure would be amazing. Got any actual evidence that isn't, wrong to back that up for the parts of science it is at odds with in your mind?
And I hope some of you now know it better than you did. And that's the first time you've ever heard it. I hope I challenged you.
Well, there was some challenge. I had to look up about 12.5 sources to write this whole 40-page script.
I remember being challenged when I was 18. I was like, this is crazy. This can't possibly be true. And now I believe it. But now I've got a lot more information than I did back then.
Well, a lot more misinformation.
So it's for you. Please take this and use it as you can. And take it and use it to impact somebody else's life.
I'll do my best. And after this, it's just some prayer. I have nothing to say about prayer, so I won't. Well, that was a long video full of a lot of nonsense and apparently outright lies. Dr. Carter, if you're listening, I'm open to you telling me why it is that all this demonstrably false information was given to your audience. I suspect, though, that if this video series gets any response from you, it'll be in the form of a whiny blog post with no attempts to address any of it, or any real attempt to fix your own errors. As for my audience, I hope you enjoyed this far more than I enjoyed writing the script. If you did, why not like the video and leave a comment? If you didn't, tell me why not in the comments, and dislike the video. Either way, if you want to see more of my content, be sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have more content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Benthoven, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Veed, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. The people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.